here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned. Immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the academic author Ian Trowell, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love and poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Wrote a book on Throbbing Gristle titled Throbbing Gristle and Endless Discontent, available from all good bookshops but also online. Intellect Books, I do believe. So if you want to just I'll put a link in the notes below so you'll be able to click on it and find out more about the book and various other ways of being able to buy a copy. But anyway, this is going to be the interview, so you'll find out everything about him and this book in this fascinating chat. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. Ian, it's over to you.
Wow, so we're quite close in age. So I was born in summer 65. Some people talk about having this epiphany, when they're like 10 years old or something. I've not got any of those memories. I remember the material quality of records, just holding vinyl records, the labels. I really liked those, was it the Bell records, the Gary Glitter Band and all those, yes, that kind of logos and the feel of them. I was obsessed with coloured vinyl and with picture discs. And then I would say I've got a memory of the first singles I bought were Hurry Up Harry by Sham 69 and Ever Falling in Love by the Buzzcocks. So this would be 78 and I'd be 13. So quite a late kind of bloomer to things. And then really, and I talk about this in the book a little bit because the book, not perhaps to what everybody would think, but it kind of pits Throbbing Gristle in the punk and in the post-punk environments because they were coterminous with those movements. And in 79, punk was in this kind of commercial heyday. I was doing some of the analysis and quite often it'd have like a majority on top of the pops. You'd have 5 punk and new wave acts out of 9 acts or 10 acts. You'd have Squeeze, the Buzzcocks, Sham, all of these bands, the Stranglers, the Pistols, who were like doing the Flogging a Dead Horse, Sid Sings, Frigging in the Rigging. These were the things that grabbed us at school. And then obviously everybody, for me, remembers May 79, Gary Newman on the Whistle Test, and then on Top of the Pops the week after. And it just felt like something was totally new. The two-tone movement also came through in 79. Lots of kids in our school were into that. So there was all this kind of playground rivalry, mods, young punks, Newmanoids. So that was my growing up. And then I started going to gigs in 79. So I was, it was the back end of 79. So I'd be 14. So the first band I went to see would be the Buzzcocks on their big commercial tour. I'd got my blue and white fluffy jumper on, my tartan trousers, and obviously Joy Division opened the set. So technically they were the first band that I saw, which is nice. And they had an imprint on me, and I went away and bought Unknown Pleasures. I was only a little lad. And I think, that changed me from then onwards. I'd gone to my first gig as like a little daft cookie cutter punk, and I came away with a kind of instinct for something different. So a lot of my gig going in 1980, we were lucky enough in Derby to have this derelict theatre, which was run as this like deranged youth club, and all of the post-punk bands of the time, Magazine, Bauhaus, Killing Joke, Crass, The Slits, Psychedelic Furs, they all played. So I was going to these gigs as a 14-year-old going on 15. So that's where I started. with things.
Yes, my God, that's quite an intense beginning, isn't it? Really, for somebody who's still in their mid-teen periods. I must admit, I was thinking that set the bar rather high. It's a bit like when one interviews somebody from the sort of more 60s period, and they go, "Oh yes, I saw Hendrix and the Doors," and you think, "Oh yeah, okay, that's quite handy, isn't it? Really?" And stuff like that. But yes, Joy Division, the Buzzcocks, yeah, does rather put it. So when you got into the kind of the glorious 80s period, I mean, obviously this was the post-punk world, and that had slightly slipped into the world of, I suppose we'd had sort of the Blitz kids, new romantic stuff. Then there was kind of like the goth world. There was psychobilly, anarcho-punk. Then there was indie pop came along around 83. What was your kind of the rest of your 80s like? At this stage, there'd been Rock Against Racism that was coming up towards things like the Red Wedge and the Redskins and Billy Bragg and Junior.
I think I had a go at all of those things on your list. I certainly had a little new romantic spell. So I remember, and I've still got them in my drawer, I got the first issue of The Face, and I had The Face delivered to my house in Derby from May 1980 up until when I left home in autumn 84. So that was a big influence on me as a kind of insight into the scenes. I was really interested in dressing up and looks and things like this, as well as the music. So I tried the new romantic thing. I remember, I've got a really strong memory of going across to Nottingham to Rock City to try and see Japan. And I'd still be 15 then, and it was an 18 nightclub, and I was young looking, and I stood in the queue, and there was all these kind of new romantics, but they didn't have the magic of a glossy magazine. There was like makeup but stubble and BO and beer breath, and it took away the magic. And then I got to the doorman, and he just said, "No, you're not coming in. How old are you?" I said, "Oh, I'm 18. No, go home." And that was the end of my new romantic period. I had a spell then being obsessed with rockabilly. There was like a kind of a dressy rockabilly scene. I really liked the Polecats. I got to know the Polecats because I really liked the way they dressed. And by then I was kind of going to London to buy clothes and things like that. Things changed fast. About 2 months later, I'd been to something new. I liked the postcard scene. I had a big crush on Edwin and all of that look. They were fantastic.
My God, that's very good. Postcard records and the Polecats. This is you're straddling the 80s. Did you become a little bit obsessed with dear old Morrissey and Ma at any stage in your?
No, they played one of their breakthrough gigs at Derby at the Assembly Rooms in 83. It was recorded for the Old Grey Whistle Test. And I'd seen the Smiths a couple of times, and I just couldn't. No, they were a band I couldn't get. I have a lot of stick from my wife because she's a massive Smiths fan, and she works with the guy who's like a clone of Morrissey, and I'm like, well, I wasn't bothered, but I did see them quite a few times early on. I remember they played a Christmas gig at Leicester University, and we sneaked in. We climbed in through a window, and it was the changing rooms of one of the band members. So that was that's my only kind of memory of Morrissey, and I never bothered anything more of that. No.
So then did you have your university period during the late 80s? Was this your period where you went off and got your grant?
I had a year. I did my A-levels, and then I kind of hurried to university and packed it in because I ended up at Colchester, and it was a real culture shock for me. It was horrendous at the University of Essex. So I thought that was in London, which it isn't. So I then just packed that in and had a year just messing about, going to gigs. Probably got into the goth thing a little bit. I hooked up with a couple of fledgling goth bands, which I'm not going to mention their names.
Excellent.
And I was roadieing for them a little bit. And
my God, you must mention their names now. God,
no, absolutely no. They. If you imagine the worst of the goth bands, you've probably got it. And then in '84, I started university again at Sheffield, and I really knew when I moved to Sheffield I had to up my game, because Sheffield didn't follow the trends. It had its own style. So it had the kind of electronic industrial, but it was a really dressy scene. Obviously, those things attracted me. Mal and Richard Kirk out of Cabaret Voltaire, they were such good dressers and posers. You know, they propped the bars up at various clubs, and there was never a hair out of place. And so this fascinated me. So I felt I had to kind of adopt a Sheffield cool kind of look and explore some of that music. I'd seen Cabaret Voltaire and 23 Skidoo in the early 80s, but it allowed me to bring all that back in and focus on that, a certain ratio. So maybe a little bit late to those things. I had experienced them and seen them, but then I really started to focus on those kind of post-industrial bands and that look, those kind of, army clothes and big black work coats and things like that. So that was my Sheffield kind of inauguration.
Yes, because I know Cherry Red Records brought out one of those compilations kind of a few years ago. I think it was either 4 or 5 track LP, which was quite extraordinary. And it's interesting with the UK. I mean, America's even more so, where each kind of state has such a different music scene, doesn't it? And sometimes the UK, you feel like everything's the same, but then certain moments come and you think, God, Sheffield is very different to that compilation, that the Manchester one or the Liverpool one. It just is on its own, really.
Yeah, it's those Cherry Red things are relentless, aren't they? I've just bought some this week to they're relentless. The Sheffield one's interesting because there was a disagreement and Cabaret Voltaire never ended up on it, which was a bit sad. But obviously they were Sheffield, but it did have its own scene. Certainly in the Throbbing Gristle book I wrote, I dedicated one of the chapters. So the chapters run through a selection of performances. They hinge around that. And I included the 1980 Throbbing Gristle performance in Sheffield with Cabaret Voltaire. And then the chapter just got so long because I just thought I really want to get to the bottom of Sheffield music, because it kind of exists as cliches a little bit, and then some of the cliches pick up errors and the errors become embedded. And I was fascinated so I'd listened to every Throbbing Gristle performance, and the one when they turn up in Sheffield, which is their second time there, it's like industrial strength bleach just poured all over, and it's nothing like they've done. It's almost like goes back to their hardcore kind of noise of when they started out. So they spent 1979-80 finessing 20 jazz funk greats and Heathen Earth, and then they just turn up at Sheffield and it's just real like anger and energy. And I was just trying to understand that and how the Sheffield people felt that. So, and it was almost as if it was to say to Sheffield, look, you've got your electronic music, you're making a name for yourself. The press are sniffing around. They've given your city a label. Come on, just do more. Just don't accept archetypes. Just always break them. And it did have an influence on a lot of people. I interviewed about 10 or 15 people who were kind of minor musicians or became musicians based upon that gig. Who just felt, wow, yeah, we can do more than just pretend to be the Human League or something like that. So
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Sheffield.
So your Sheffield was 30 years. So yes, the book. Let's get to the book. So when did you decide to put this together? This kind of amazing work of academia, really, isn't it?
There's kind of two ways of looking at how it came to be. So there is Throbbing Gristle in my mind. How long have they been in my mind? We spoke about earlier before we pressed record, but about growing up in Derby in 1979. So Throbbing Gristle played in Derby in April 79, and that was 6 months before I started going to gigs. So I kind of think, oh damn, I missed that. But then I'm thinking, would my 13-year-old self have had the nous to go, to this event? I don't think so. I just think it would have been too obscure. But it was something that was talked about in Derby, so that's how I got the kind of bug of Throbbing Gristle. Everybody in Derby spoke about this gig. So there were two gigs, Throbbing Gristle and Crass, and they were both different music. They used films and visuals. The band were presenting themselves in a different way, this kind of militaristic style of presentation, and it had a big impact on people. So a lot of the post-punk bands in Derby, who never recorded records. There's no Cherry Red Derby CD, and I don't think there ever will be. But there was a scene there, and they were influenced by Throbbing Gristle. Obviously, then when I moved to Sheffield, Throbbing Gristle were part of they were kind of part of the DNA in Sheffield, as much as they weren't a Sheffield band. There was such a synergy with Throbbing Gristle. So they've been with me for a long, long time. And the more I looked at them, I was interested in how they were like a foil for the time, for the late 70s, and how they pushed, how they were very dark, and it was a very dark time. So I thought, there's things to say here. There's things that were kind of, I couldn't get out of my system. The book itself started in a more mundane fashion. I started to research the performance they did at the Architectural Association in London in 78. There's been a lot of mythology accrued about this gig, particularly by P-Orridge in his typical kind of fabulating memoirs of the gig being this kind of an explosion of violence, a bit like a Richard Allen skinhead style novel where there's riots and he's kicking people and their teeth are flying out and all these things. So I started to get into looking at this gig, and I was going to write quite a boring academic paper because I was at the stage in my life when I was trying to make myself become an academic, which never happened. And the paper never came to anything, but I got a chapter, and I thought, wow, I could actually work backwards and use this, because I found so much interesting new angles to write about. I guess I backtrack. I got Simon Ford's 1999 book, Records of Civilization. I knew Simon when he wrote that, and was corresponding with him, and he asked me down to DJ at the launch when they did that at the ICA. I think 98, 99. Yes. So that was always looming over me, Simon's book. And I always thought, I can't write anything on Throbbing Gristle because Simon has absolutely nailed this. He's such a great writer. He had the ear of all four of the band members when they were not trying to kind of tear each other apart as much as they were now, or they were when I was writing. So it was only once I'd researched the architectural thing when I realised actually a lot of what Simon wrote about that gig is based upon what Genesis P-Orridge told him, and it's just all a load of fancy poppycock, really, which is fine. That is what carries forward for people.
Yes.
That's what informs and inspires people. But I was kind of interested in also, well, what really went on, because there is something interesting going on there that is a reflection of the time, not just a reflection of how P-Orridge wanted to be remembered. And so that was, I felt I got enough of just from that one gig to go away and explore some other places. So I tried to pick some places that had been overlooked. The Wakefield gig in 78, there's been nothing researched on that. So that was one that I was desperate to find out about. The gig at Derby in 79, obviously for personal reasons, and the gig at Sheffield in 1980. So with those, I've got like 4 coordinates in Throbbing Gristle's timeline when they were very different in terms of that they will say, we didn't have track lists, everything was spontaneous, but they did kind of evolve, and they did have sets, as we might call them. So it came together in that way.
Yes.
But then we had COVID right, was in the middle of it, so that put a big stop on it, just mentally and like practically, so I wanted it. It was nearly ready in 2019, and then it died, and it took about 3 years for me to pick it back up. So it's a long way.
It's a long, God, it's been a hell of a journey, hasn't it? Because it's kind of interesting. The 70s, obviously, we were both a bit too young for it, but can remember sort of the news and it's kind of politically sort of shift in time of, different people going into number 10. And then obviously 79 is when Thatcher gets in. There's that winter of discontent around that period as well. There'd been that 3-day week. There'd been a lot of strikes, the IRA. So Throbbing Gristle then kind of comes out of a lot of that kind of breakdown in society at this stage, doesn't it? Don't they?
Sure, they were a product of that time. They a lot of people assume they were an art school band. That's a real common misunderstanding, and none of them went to art school. They were self-taught, autodidactic art people. They were interested in art. They learnt about art, but they did it off their own, using their own resources and using their own syllabuses or whatever, to do that. So, but they were also really rooted in the 70s, and you get glimpses of that when you read certainly Cosey's art, sex, music, get them in the right sex. Yeah, when you read that, you get little glimpses of them watching Doctor Who, and then there's programs like Survivors and things. And I think this gets into the fabric of the band, this really eerie late 70s period when there was quite a lot of dystopia and quite chilling, unnerving aspects of entertainment. And then obviously they push for the worst aspects, the abject, they see how far we can go. I mean, this is one of the problems with the band, one of the things that divides people, to say, why the hell do you want to be kind of rekindling like serial killers and things like that? And there's been various explanations by the band members as to why they do it, but none of it really fits together. So you have to find your own way through that, and deal with the demons of it, and to try and. But you think, well, what's pop music? Is pop music supposed to be uplifting? What is the function of this? And those things can start falling away. We don't question abject themes in art, quite often not in cinema, but we seem to have trouble with them in music because we associate we associate the words of the musician with the thoughts of the musician, you know, and their views and their virtues and stuff like that. And that's not necessarily meant to be, you know.
No,
Who knows
I
what
mean,
was with the band?
yes. So just briefly then, do you want to just give us a little bit of a, before we get back into the book, a little bit of the history of how the band got together? Because there's 4 members, aren't they? And they're all very different. And I know one of them, because I've sort of done interviews with, is it Aubrey, who's done Hipgnosis, this kind of amazing...
Oh, wow, right. Okay.
They did the whole record label gig, didn't they? And he's kind of one of the team of the other 2, really, isn't he? This is Peter, who's
Yes.
kind of, he gives them a little bit more edge as they get lost in their haze of hippiedom and sort of, you know, I don't know, probably smoking pot, stuff like that.
I think that one of the things that made the product of Throbbing Gristle, the sound, the whole package was the differences in the four people. That, you know, it was almost this kind of dissonance, and in a normal situation it would work against, and it would just, things would collapse, but it worked. They seemed to work with their differences, with their antagonisms, and then they got shared antagonisms with society or with the music press. So but it seemed to produce something totally different in terms of their backgrounds. Peter Christopherson was incredibly interesting. You know, his father was an academic at Cambridge, where I'm working in a library in Cambridge, and Dermot Christopherson was like a proper tenured academic at Cambridge. I've been trying to get at the archives to see if there's anything in there that has a hint as to what formed Peter, because Peter was as sleazy as he was known. He truly was an odd person, you know. I think he was private in many ways. In the early days of Throbbing Gristle, when they'd formulated in 75 nominally, he drifted in and out. They did a handful of art events and he wasn't present in them, and it was only when it took off a bit he started to bring in his ideas. So he was interested in the power of sampling and going out doing kind of illicit, secretive recordings. Then also a lot of the themes of like marginal practices around sex and things like that. So he brought all this seediness in there. He was part of Hipgnosis, so he was an incredibly talented photographer and designer. The bits I've seen where in Hipgnosis, I think they really have to keep a tight leash on him, because the few projects where he's had his own way, they've just been like, whoa, that is just not nice. That is not going to sell records. But that's Peter. Obviously Genesis, P-Orridge and Cosey came down as a couple from Hull. They'd been involved in the hippie art scene there, this kind of antagonist, Dadaist style, subcultural thing. Then they were on the run from various authorities and skinhead and biker gangs, and they set up in London, and that was the start of, they were carrying on their COUM Transmissions project, which drew in Peter Christopherson because there was a high sex content to the performances, in terms of like lots of bizarre sadomasochistic bodily experiments, and Christopherson was drawn to that. Finally, Chris Carter, who is again a bit of a mystery guy, he was doing electronic lights and sound shows, so another totally different angle on things. But he was friends. I'm trying to think now. The guy out the Alberts.
Not Bruce Lacey.
Yes. So one of them's dad was the caretaker at the at the artist studios. So there was these connections in there. I did kind of plot them out in the book, but it's only like a minor part early on, and I can't. Yes, so
I think there was it the Michael Bentine, Bruce Lacey. There was I can't remember who else. It was the Alberts. Yes,
yes.
Performance art.
So there is the book that. So Simon Ford's book does the backstory a lot. So I didn't really want to kind of regurgitate that, because there was nothing more I could add to that. There's a book called Unlimited Action by Dominic Johnson, which is very much worth reading. I think that's on Manchester University Press. And he has a couple of chapters devoted to the early art actions of Throbbing Gristle and that scene as well, and some of the people in the art scene that were close by doing very it's not what I call conceptualist art. It's more provocational, anti-art actions and things like that. So yeah, those were the elements that came together. And then I would also say and some people would disagree with this, but I would say what really sparked them off was punk, not as something to say, let's go on and do this. But I think that initially they thought, oh, this is a way in. We don't want to be punk, but it is a way in, and we can get in here and we can cause a bit of trouble and see what happens. So that's why the book runs along with the ideas of punk and then post-punk, because they see it as a form that will give them a way in, but then straight away they want to push it out of shape or push it beyond its comfort zones, which they do straight away. But it takes a while. There's a lot of push and pull, I think, with the Sex Pistols. If you listen to the early gigs, P-Orridge in particular seems to have a real obsession with Johnny Rotten, as he was called then, and he crops up in a lot of his rants and things like that. And it takes them. They again, in Cosey's book, there's this like group meeting quite early on when they say, look, we're not a punk band, we need to set out our stall here and decide where we are with it. Cosey's relented a little bit recently. So in her Sisters book, she actually has a more considered view, and she talks about Throbbing Gristle's relationship to punk. And it was good for me to read that, because that came out after I'd finished my kind of first draft. And I always knew Cosey in her first book was very much to say we were nothing to do with punk, but then in the second book she acknowledges Throbbing Gristle's relationship to it. And so I thought, phew, that made me feel a little bit like I've not upset her or got on the wrong side of her in that regard.
Yes, that would have been. So do you just explain what happened the mid-70s exhibition in Hull then, the COUM exhibition? How did this come about with Cosey and Genesis? What was the kind of idea of this?
There's quite a long running story there, and again, P-Orridge's recent, so the biography, the autobiography he finished just before they died. Non-binary talks about this. I would say the first half of non-binary is really, it's written in a really lovely style, very rich, very dense, and not how much of it you can take as gospel, I'm not sure, but there are some kind of ways where you start to understand the time and the character that forms P-Orridge. They arrive at Hull expecting to do a certain type of degree, and they've realised they're on the wrong degree, and they're doing something like a business administration degree, and they just like, no, we're going to drop out of this. They have this. They go and stay with David Medler and the Exploding Galaxy people in London, and they have this kind of revelation to be an artist. Come back up to Hull and set up a collective, which becomes COUM.
Is that those people then?
I'll put my glasses on. Hang on.
Just to sort of
go and show me again. Yeah, so you've got. I've not seen that book. I should have. You're making me feel really, really insufficient now. But yes, so those people. So he had contact with them. He didn't agree with them entirely. He's got his kind of criticisms of them as their book Non-Binary. It's this criticism of everything, and he tried to set something similar up in Hull, and obviously Hull isn't the cultural hotspot of London. It's the exact opposite, but they were trying to make it as starving artists, getting different bits of grants from the Arts Association, doing lots of Dadaist and Vienna actionist style things, which, would have involved kind of lots of, body fluids and mutilation and things like that. And Cosey, there's the story about how they met and the infatuation. And she became part of that, like an integral part of COUM. And eventually Cosey and Genesis headed down to London because things became too hot in Hull. They'd crossed various kind of people within the law and outside the law, and they needed to make a getaway. There's a lot of this in P-Orridge's book, but I'm just not sure how much of it is fact, but it makes exciting reading.
Yes, absolutely. It's kind of an interesting cultural time, isn't it? Because there are these kind of things going on. There's the sort of the post-60s kind of world that had sort of had its heyday and sort of finished on a bit of a downer with people like, the death of so many of those icons like Morrison, Joplin, Hendrix, Brian Jones, Altamont. But there was still an idealistic quality of that generation who weren't really that old. They were still sort of wanting to live the dream, weren't they? They were starting to sort of move out of the cities into the countryside, setting up these rather quaint little fairs and festivals and running around like medieval people in Barsham Fair or Albion Fairs. So there was this kind of, the slightly older generation would have been absolutely horrified by these groups who were probably only about 5 or 8 years younger. But culturally, massive difference, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a weird time. I mean, there has been some writing on that, and the kind of the lazy way of configuring it is, punk was like the year zero, which just said we are not going to look back. That anything up until and before punk, it's just we're not going to have any truck with it. We're just going to start the tabula rasa, But Throbbing Gristle certainly bridged that. Even bands like Crass, they were part. They had a theatre. Was it Exit or something? Was their theatre performances in that time? This mid-70s idealistic, hedonistic, retreat to the countryside type thing. I don't think COUM and Exit, who became who had Penny and all the members of Crass involved ever did cross paths, but they were kind of moving in the same circles. Yes, definitely.
Yes, but Penny had sort of come from quite a middle-class background, hadn't he? I mean, I'm not knocking that because you can't change it, but he was always going to have a little bit more sophistication and a bit more confidence that happens sometimes from the class background that one's grown up with. And also then he became quite obsessed with the Windsor Free Festival with this guy Wally Hope. So he'd obviously sort of was going to be veering towards the hippie culture of, but he loved jazz, wasn't he? That was his thing, kind of cool jazz. And and then there was this kind of free festival movement. And again, that's so different to the world of Throbbing Gristle. And you know, you either take an acid with Hawkwind and, you know, wondering what it's going to, you know, be on a field, or yes, in these industrial sites, which are very different kind of emotionally and spiritually.
Sure, yeah, I mean, you know, for me, growing up just as punk had happened, the idea of a festival was just horrendous. You know, I never associated punk with like sitting in a field listening to loads of bands. The closest I got to a festival was going to a few of the Futurama's in Leeds, which was just grim. You know, you were locked into this massive old bus depot, which was foul and cold, and the floor was stained, and it was, yeah, you know, you were just kind of forced to listen to this music, and that felt more like, yeah, you know, this is like an anti-festival. It's nothing to do with, you know, kind of free space and making plans for a better way of life. It's just this, well, you know, it's almost like we've come here to kind of punish ourselves. And that's the world that I knew musically. I mean, I'm still like that. I'm 58 now, and I've never been to Glastonbury ever, and I've never wanted to go. The closest I got was I was in Denmark one year picking strawberries, and we went to Roskilde, which was like the version of Glastonbury, I think. But yeah, we sneaked in and we saw Sonic Youth, which was all right, made it okay. But the rest of it, I just felt uncomfortable because I thought, oh God, this is like a pop festival, and it's not part of how I understand and experience music. And I've always kept that with me, you know. I would much rather see a band in an oppressive small space, and it's loud and it's vibrating and it's uncomfortable, and there's like sweat dripping down the walls, and it's dark, and yeah, that's how I like, you know, it's how I like things. And that's quite a lot of the venues that Throbbing Gristle play in, anarchist centres and like broken down cinemas and things like that, you know. Yeah.
Just briefly, did you see the film on the band that Dorothy Max Pryor was in, Rima, that came out?
I haven't. I'd like to see that. No, I know Rima and Throbbing Gristle crossed paths. I think they were both playing at so there was a big post-punk festival in summer '79 at the YMCA in London over 4 days, and I think Rima might have been playing there. It was previous to Futurama, so I mean, people generally associate Futurama in Leeds as the start of that kind of cohesion of it, but I think the event there.
Yes, well, I think you would love it. Obviously, John Robb appears, but it's everywhere, doesn't he? But there's also Fetus. There was Thurwell appears on it, and all the members, apart from Marco Peroni, who has nothing to do with it. But it's a great film, and great to sort of see the little clips of it. So look, going back to the book again, it's quite a dense introduction, isn't it? And you use various mythology. It's a What's your sort of, how do you tackle these chapters on these live concerts and live events that holds the book together?
I'm glad you've asked me that. So I guess, yeah, one of the bugbears that people might find with the book is the punk thing, and I've tried to explain that a little bit. And the other one is academia and academic language. And I know some people have already kind of grumbled about that.
Oh no, I find it kind of fascinating. So, oh, this is quite different.
I'm just going to set out. So the publishers, Intellect, are an academic publisher. They are interested in cultural studies and kind of niche areas of performance and things like that. And Russ Spesti and a couple of others have set up the Global Punk Studies wing of that, they were kind enough to take on my book, rescue it, because I kind of thought it was going to go somewhere else, and then it didn't. And then somebody said to me, "Yeah, we'll take it on, but we just really want you to rewrite Simon Ford's book because they're never going to repress that." And I said, "Well, I don't want to do that because Simon Ford's book's out there and they might repress it, and I want to do something myself." So Intellect picked it up. So it is written for an academic publisher. So I guess that first chapter is an obligation of sorts to make it feel like an academic book and set out some ideas. And I think some of those ideas are used, some of those methodologies. So I'm interested in mythology, and I think that plays a big part in music and how music's carried forward into the future. And Throbbing Gristle played with mythology, so I think that's one of the methodologies I look at. I'm interested in noise and the value of noise. There has been a lot of academics that have jumped to write about noise, people like Hegarty. Gosh.
Yes. The Rest is Noise. Is that the book, The Rest is Noise?
Hang on, I'm going to just give you a second's silence. Yeah. Paul Hegarty.
Yes.
Noise, music, history, and there's a few others. So that was one of the things. And then I was interested in concepts of memory and being there, and the fact that Throbbing Gristle archived all of their performances. So this was something that was very much an artistic residue they picked up. So there was self-documentation. So what we are left with are sets of digital files now of every performance they did. And so we feel that you can kind of feel that you're perpetually there all the time, and we're not. So I was interested in the difference between feeling that you were there and being there, and what's lost in between those things. So those were some of the methodologies. And then I guess I'm interested in art and visual culture. And so there are lots of theorists who write about art and have ideas because they say art speaks certain things, but the art that they talk about is art from the canon or even art from the avant-garde canon, not necessarily popular art, pop videos, picture sleeves, fashion and things like that. So I'm kind of interested in saying, well, yeah, these are important artifacts. So can we use some of these high-end theories? Have they got, can we claim them for ourselves? I don't want to bring them in as ornamentation to say, oh, look, Derrida or something like that. I know a bit about this. I want to say, look, they're used elsewhere. So have they got use here? And if they haven't got use here, then you can call them out as, Emperor's New Clothes. I'm interested in those things, just exploring academic ideas. But I think the book does run. I think once you've got that first chapter out of the way, it's probably not the best way to structure a book to say, just get through that first chapter, because then it gets easier, because then it's testimony, then it works through the gigs. And so if you're there for the kind of factual, spotting of things and the dates and the details, then that's what follows. But I try and arm people with these tools to start with, to say, look, Throbbing Gristle they encouraged you to think, to read, to write, to explore. They were interested in esoteric philosophers. social and cultural theorists like William Burroughs and people like that. And, you know, they're academic. They're people that require you to think outside of standard ways of thinking, standard reference frames. So that's important. I wanted to kind of adhere to the spirit of that thinking, and that's the idea, really.
Yes, no, it's a fascinating opening, chapter. It's a lot to sort of digest and sort of think about. And it was interesting what you mentioned about sort of the members of the band with their own mythology as well, and their own sort of narrative, and who tells the story and who tells it their way, which isn't, or what do they leave out, what do they include, what do they emphasize, how do they rework this kind of landscape, really, or soundscape as well. And it's kind of interesting what you've discovered with the members of the band and yourself. So do you sort of also feel quite critical in a nice way of each of them as well as being fascinated with them?
I'm not sure if you're asking the question that is the horrible question, but I'll answer it as the horrible question, which is the narrative now has fell apart. The band, there's a lot of friction emerging, and there's a lot of different attempts to kind of, I wouldn't just say control the narrative, but to think about it in different ways. I've certainly had types of comments that have been, why the hell you're writing a book about this band? P-Orridge is a horrible person. Someone said, I hope P-Orridge doesn't feature in the book, which is like crazy, Yeah. But then, there's more subtle things that it's very, very difficult to take on board and to deal with I don't want to call what Cosey says as accusations, because they will, they are truths. It was everything that the band did was unorthodox, and their approach to relationships was unorthodox. I mean, I am quite a boring person when it comes to things like relationships, but the band were not. None of them were, and fine. That informed their kind of creative fire, but it bursts its bounds in the end. It overflowed, and it consumed itself. And we've had an environment over the past few decades where the Throbbing Gristle story has been kind of ripped apart and contested by various people. And I've had things like to say, well, Throbbing, you should write about what Throbbing Gristle could have been if P-Orridge wasn't such a control freak. And it's like, well, no, I can't write about those things. I'm writing about what they presented, which was like this fantastic, awkward, intense body of work. And that's what's there to write about. I don't want to kind of implicate Cathy Unsworth, and but I noted in her recent book on goth, she came to the section on the Cocteau Twins, and I never realised that there'd been a similar horrendous exploitative relationship with the two, with Liz and Robin in the Cocteau Twins. I didn't realise this, and Cathy talks about this, and it's almost as if she writes. It reveals itself to her, and she kind of says, oh, it makes me feel like I can't listen to them anymore. I can't listen to those beautiful, nonsensical words, because what they are actually are cries of pain and things. So there's a similar thing here to say, I've had this about Throbbing Gristle to say, that there was just this bullying, manipulative relationship that was there all the time. And so your priority should be to unearth that and to expose that and to call it out. But I don't know, I've not I don't know if that's productive. Cosey does that in both of her books. P-Orridge responds in a pretty shoddy way in their autobiography. I don't know what to think. To me, that's I don't know. It's not always what I want to read about, but I appreciate that is the narrative.
Yes,
that is a narrative in there.
But it's interesting on a personal level when one has to face something, in this example, mostly music, but perhaps art as well, and you realise that the people making it aren't quite that together, and then you have that kind of internal kind of wrestle with oneself about, well, should I keep listening to it because I know what this person becomes? But at the time, perhaps that person was okay, but then he becomes this. I'm thinking of Morrissey, basically. So what does this kind of do for myself? And I know the Cocteau Twins story. Bizarrely, I've done interviews with 2 of those 3 members, and so you get this kind of feeling of but then, as you probably realise, when you're in that band, it's an incredibly dysfunctional relationship that is incredibly damaging. And most people I speak to often say, I wish I'd walked away a bit earlier, but I'm kind of glad they didn't, because they still made this amazing music that possibly could only be made in those conditions. And that is a tricky one, because if you didn't have those conditions and they weren't so peculiar and odd, perhaps we would just be, just shrugging our shoulders and thinking it's kind of average, but there's nothing special. But then you hear something special, then you dig down, and then you sort of realise these are some quite difficult people or some quite unpleasant people. And, what do you do if you think the music's beautiful, but you realise it's kind of written from a place of pain, which probably a lot of art is, but,
I said earlier about the best part of Throbbing Gristle is that it comes from this productive dissensus, this tension. There's a moment on a 3rd annual report where each of the 4 band members goes off to do an individual track, and to me, they're not the strongest tracks. It's almost like an indication of where they might go. And then the band, when they split, it splits into 2. And you get Chris and Cosey making their music, and it's clinical, it's clean, it's articulate, it's very, it's on the cutting edge of synthesizer music. But you really want that dirt and that kind of crazed ranting that P-Orridge would bring to things, but it's not there. And then you've got Psychic TV, which is just P-Orridge's project, really. And to me, that didn't do anything to me either. It was probably weirdly, it was only when Psychic TV split again and you'd got Christopherson on his own, Sleazy on his own doing Coil, that I found something that was engaging me just briefly before they went, before the kind of dance music scene swooped upon them. The first 4 or 5 Coil albums and cassettes, to me, had the spirit of things. I didn't care for anything Psychic TV did, and I didn't really care for any of the Chris and Cosey stuff. That sounds quite harsh, but just didn't work for me compared to something like Journey Through a Body or Heathen Earth, all those kind of live Throbbing Gristle moments. They were fantastic, crazy releases, just so much energy and chaos and unpredictability. That was, you'd got Chris Carter, who would tether the whole thing together, and P-Orridge would be trying to pull it apart, and it would just hold just at the point of breaking down, but it would be still being held together. Tracks like Discipline emerging as like a spontaneous gesture, fantastic.
Yes,
not get that again.
Did you also get into the German bands like Enstreis and Neubauten?
Oh, indeed, yes. I guess I was early, saw those a few times in the early days when they first did their gigs in the UK. I really like Laibach as well. 23 Skidoo, I like. They were the kind of immediate proteges of Throbbing Gristle, really, with them being the kind of figurehead of Fetish Records and that scene. But yeah, Neubauten, I still like them. You know, I still keep an eye on them. I still will go and try and see them when they play live. Yeah, incredible. Another incredible band. Yeah,
I do love Leibach. They're one of those ones that on so many levels, I just find them so stimulating, exciting, and even their later
mad.
Have you ever seen them live?
I saw them very, very early on when he used to have the antler horns on his head and things like this. This would be about 85 or 86 or something like that, before they signed to Mute. And it was powerful stuff because it was just like mad propaganda, and they were knocking around with Last Few Days, who were also just nutcases. And then you'd got things like, you know, the Occupied Europe tour. So you'd got 23 Skidoo, Last Few Days, and Leibach. And Fritz was drumming for all three bands, which is just mad. But yeah, great.
Yes.
Great. But I've not seen them. I've not seen Leibach recently since they've gone. I don't know. They must have gone through various phases since then. But I do listen to them. I need to go and try and see them at some point.
Yes, well, yeah, they are stunning, and I must admit, there's so much there. So with doing the research and putting this book together, did you get to? How many members of the band had you sort of met personally and interviewed?
There's nothing there at all, I'm afraid. So I knew them a little bit from the time when Simon was doing the research for Wreckers, but since Wreckers had come out, there was like a massive breakdown in friendships between Simon and the band members, and various kind of mudslingings and stuff. So when I started writing this, obviously Sleazy had been he was no longer with us. I reached out to Chris and Cosey through various means, through Mute, through Cabinet Gallery, just to say I'm writing this book, but I never got anywhere with it. And I didn't reach out to P-Orridge. I felt that a lot of what Cosey had got to say was in her book, was in her autobiography, and I was interested in the gaps in there. So, for instance, 1979 there's just almost nothing, and to me, musically, Throbbing Gristle then were at their, really powerful. So I just thought, well, that's really interesting, that she feels there's nothing to say of interest in that area then. So I just wanted to talk then to try and recreate in my mind what was going on at these events, to talk to people who'd been what they'd been inspired to do. So it became more about Throbbing Gristle as a force, as a sphere of influence, and those types of things. And then also as a kind of placeholder for the dark 1970s as well. And, I thought, I can do this. I don't need testimony from the band. And I particularly didn't need testimony from the band when all they wanted to do was tear a strip off each other and also say, well, that's all lies, or that didn't happen, or they didn't do that, I did it, and things. I just didn't want to go down those lines, really.
Yes, my God, it's such a great. You must have been exhausted when you finished this book, actually, because it is quite very dense and colossal piece of work.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it felt like I was getting about 30 or 40 years off my chest, you know, that I'd carried this interest and this attract, you know, I've collected the records from, obviously not at the time in the late 70s, but from about, certainly from the early 80s onwards, I'd started to collect. And then we had the bootlegging craze of the mid 80s. So, you know, there was so much material coming, and it had stayed with me. You know, I've had records and sold records all the time, but there's some records that have stayed with me all the time, and that all the Throbbing Gristle stuff would be in that, you know. And yeah, and it was a challenge because they're just, you know, it's horrible. There's this horrible side to it, which then births the kind of next generation of horrible music, you know, like White House and all that power electronic stuff. So not just this is a harsh noise, but, you know, well, I wouldn't say like the celebration of the abject, but certainly just the kind of relentless calling out of the most abject things in society. And it's powerful stuff, and it's hard, you know. And yeah, I wanted to get it out of my system. I'm not sure if I did, you know. I think I don't quite get there. That I try and get. There's a few points in the book where I try and get to the bottom. So there's a massive section on the Yorkshire Ripper, and the Wakefield section. So what I'm interested in there is that the band turn up in Wakefield, and the Ripper, he wasn't known as the Ripper. He might have been, yeah, he was known as he'd been christened the Yorkshire Ripper by then. And there's a feeling of terror in the air, and you would think, oh, the natural thing for Throbbing Gristle to do would be to just kind of tap into this, but they don't. They hold back for whatever reason. They hold back. Maybe that would have been a good question to ask.
Yes,
Chris and Cosey, you know, but they hold back. But the other thing about the book is that, and this was just purely by chance, all of the chapters, the case studies I did, had a contemporary reverberation. So I did a chapter on the ICA gig in 76, obviously, and that had been recreated. The Architectural Association gig had a recreation. The Sheffield gig had this sonic exorcism by some artists who went out with a tape recorder into the room where the gig took place to try and record like a Nigel Neal stone tape, like what memories are in the kind of bones of this building. They actually went into the wrong room, but never mind. I think that's funny. The Derby gig had an exhibition in a tiny gallery in Belper, just on the edge of Derby, to celebrate that. And then the Wakefield one reappears in the writing of David Peace, and I'm a big fan of David Peace's writing. And in the penultimate book in his Red Riding Quartet, he channels, it's like a P-Orridge type voice it's all nebulous. You're not sure who's the killer and who's the different killer and who's the victim. It all kind of melds into one. And yeah, I mean, it's all about the kind of reign of the Ripper and the terror of the 70s, and, you know, the brutality of the powers that be, who were fictionalized in the book as using the cloak of the Peter Sutcliffe to kind of do their own crimes and things like this. And yeah, so Throbbing Gristle reappear in David Peace. So there's more there. But in terms of actually when they turned up in 78 in Wakefield, they just there's no mention of you know, the Yorkshire Ripper. I don't think the Ripper tapes arrived by then, the spoof tape.
Oh yes,
Wearside Jack. but I talk about that in the book because the Wearside Jack tape, it's almost like it feels like a Throbbing Gristle outtake, especially with the kind of overlap of the cheesy music at the end. Yeah, it's horrible, But I wanted to really try and get into that 70s, just to get into the sheer kind of terror and the grimness of the times.
Yes, and there used to be those, I don't know if that was in the 70s or the 80s, there was the feminist movement that was developing and started having all those Reclaim the Night marches, didn't they? Which
So that was happening around that time. And then you got, Leeds at the end of the 70s and the early 80s, it was just a grim place because you'd got a really large National Front contingent. You had loads of football violence there, and there was just these awful kind of antagonisms between the Reclaim the Night movements. And I think David Haslam he makes reference to it in his book on the 70s, not ABBA. He talks about this chasm of difference between the Leeds football fans taunting the police because they can't catch the Ripper, and the kind of brave women trying to just make trying to kind of reclaim a sense of just existence.
So it's kind of weird because being a child during that time and hearing the news, I do remember being slightly terrified when I heard it. There must have been 10 living in East Anglia. There was the Black Panther before that, and then there was the Yorkshire Ripper, and these. And I'm slightly too young for the sort of the Moors murderers, but they were always there in your mind, weren't they? There was this kind of sense that there could be that could happen to you next. And yes, it's strange how that sort of permeates throughout our sort of childhood sometimes and still stays with us, thinking, God, I wonder what happened to some of those people. And you sort of Google it, and like you said, that guy Jack, Wearside Jack, with his kind of weird recording, which was even more demented, really. So
it is, isn't it? Yeah, it is. It all, but it all kind of folds in around some of the industrial music, and it's like where the borders between something being like a critical piece of work and being just like a sick, because the Wearside Jack tape was just, he wasn't a well man to do that. It's like, this is not like art or humor or anything. It's just, you're not a well man, that's.
Yes, because in that chapter you mentioned one of our favourite writers. Is it Raymond Williams, isn't it, who wrote about the...
Gosh, yes.
He wrote about the Industrial Revolution and sort of the pastoral landscape of the Great British Isles, didn't he? Raymond Williams. I can't remember his book, but I do remember doing it in history, I do believe. So that, yes, it was one of those ones our lecturer loved intensely. So, yes, I was just looking at the book.
Yes, he's interested in trying to understand culture. I guess that's the bit he only gets a brief mention, but I just felt when I did the Wakefield chapter, it was really, really, really necessary to try and say, look, I'm not just writing about this gig in 1978. I want to, I want to try and put the reader there, to put them to understand the kind of, the grime, the scuzz of the pavement, the cinema, what was in the charts, what was on the TV, what was happening around, what was the fabric of life, because that's what Williams was, one of the things he tried to kind of push forward when he was it'd be the birth of cultural studies, really, and kind of cultural Marxism and stuff like that. So he just gets a brief mention there. I'm not claiming to be a Raymond Williams expert, but I'm glad you spotted that anyway.
Yes, no, it is a brilliant, I have to say, it's kind of brilliant. And I do think, the writing, plus also a lot of the kind of images that you've got from fanzines and newspapers and the papers of the, you know, the New Musical Express, give it a lot of kind of texture, because you do sort of get transported back into that period quite easily, and bringing out those kind of elements, those cultural and news elements and the sport of that period with, you know, obviously Leeds United, and that what that meant in the 70s, and sort of the football hooligan was quite something, really.
Yeah. I think also, you know, one of the things the band did, Chris Carter and Sleazy, they did a lot of like live sweeps of TV and radio as they played. So you got snippets of what was ever happening inserted into, I guess, you know, into the moment of the gig. So you had this strange, disorienting experience of. So particularly, there's been a lot of recent reflective writing on the gig they did at Centre Iberico, the Anarchist Centre in London at the start of '79, and it was the winter of discontent kind of just kicking off, really, and it was freezing, and they played an afternoon gig. And the first 15 or so minutes are just, it's this like static and incredibly intense industrial noise, and they're sampling from the TV, and it's the big match, and it's Chelsea versus Man City, but it feels like it's being recorded in like a blizzard of electronic noise, and it's awesome. But, you know, and it's like, well, look, there is this match, you know, and it's like, oh well, we associate football now with how we associate football now, but football in 1979 was changing. You know, the boot boys were giving over to the casuals. It was a time of violence. There was no all-seater stadiums. It was a tense affair. You know, the world of going to football and going to gigs was quite separated, because, you know, if you went to a football match with any kind of weird look, you'd get a kicking from both sides. You know, I know that because I used to go to football when I was a kid, as well as beer punk, and it was a hard time, you know. So I just like that. And when they played Derby, they played Derby gig, they were doing a lot of live sampling there, and so you'd get like an advert for a sale at a furniture shop, and then some bits of the BBC News about the SNP breaking away. So that was the kind of political seed of things. And then you got some late night football results at the end of that, right in the middle of something like Hamburger Lady, you know, kind of this noise coming in. So it must have been incredible at the time. And I don't think we appreciate that now when we listen to it. I think it's important to try and understand what that might have meant at the time for someone who heard that, you know, standing there expecting maybe a punk gig. Certainly the audience in Derby would have never seen anything like Throbbing Gristle. They didn't know about it. You know, they were expecting some kind of London punk type thing, and they got this bizarre front of, you know, noise and sampling.
Amazing. It's just amazing. Were you a Derby fan, by the way?
I still am, yes. Yes, I still go.
Fantastic. It has to be done.
That's like a conversation stopper, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I have some nights when I won't put this in. I love watching old clips from the 70s, you know, football, you know, the highlights. And I have to say, you know, Derby, I didn't realise Derby was so brilliant. And Charlie George, there was a school.
I missed all that because my dad never took me. So those golden years when we won the title twice in the 70s, my dad never took me. So I didn't start going until the early 80s. So I was kind of a bit of a new romantic or a bit of a punk, and I was trying to go to the football as well, and I was getting walloped by, I always remember, I think the first match I went to, we were playing Chelsea, and someone walloped me just because I just looked the wrong type, and I thought, oh, crikey. But I kept going. I just kept going, just tone it down a bit. Yeah, but I still go. I always dress up now if I go to football. That's one of the things, you know, and you can dress up in some like...
Well, they had such an amazing team. You know, I do find the 70s football is quite extra, not the, you know, the harsh tackling. But, when I looked at that Chelsea Derby team with Charlie George and Hector and Gemmell, and I mean, they were playing these top European teams and were absolutely stunning. I mean, they had so many England players in that team. And
we had a mud bath as a pitch. That was probably our...
famous
That's
thing.
probably our best assets.
But there was, if you see the highlights, I think it was Derby against Barcelona or somebody like that. And Charlie George... there's a cross from the left. He just whacks it beautifully with his left foot, and it goes straight in the back of the net. And he's like, God, that is genius. That is, beautiful. They must have had a couple of seasons where they were just unstoppable, really. So, there you go.
Yeah, sure. But it goes wrong, and it's gone wrong now. It's never going to come back.
No,
not in my life.
Indeed. And on that bombshell, we'll leave it there. A massive thank you to Ian for giving me the time for that interview. Like I said, the book is out, titled Throbbing Gristle, An Endless Discontent. I'll put a link in the notes below. This has been the C86 show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on any of the social media platform sites. Just do C86 show. And all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.